Hello, I hope you're enjoying the EU MDR and IVDR True Quality Summit series so far. This next session is on MDR with Brexit, how the combination is impacting the European medical device industry. My name is Etienne Nichols, and I am a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for the next 45 minutes. Before I introduce our speaker, Thor Rollins from Nelson Laboratories, I have a few quick logistics to go over. We'll leave time for Q&A at the end, so please submit your questions throughout the presentation in the box on the right-hand side. This entire session is recorded, and the slides will be available for you to download on the Summit website. If you need an attendance certificate, it will be available for free through our newly launched Greenlight Guru Academy. We'll also be hosting free courses on MDR and IVDR in there shortly, so make sure you sign up for those to get free access, or be on the lookout for our follow-up email next week for more information. Finally, if you're curious about Greenlight Guru and how our medical device QMS software can help you simplify your transition and maintain compliance to EU MDR, IVDR, and other regulatory changes, be sure to head over to our website and request a demo after this session. Now I'm excited to introduce Thor Rollins. Thor Rollins is a certified microbiologist, and he specializes in the selection and conduct of in vitro and in vivo biocompatibility tests. He actively speaks on biocompatibility related topics through Nelson Labs, external seminars, webinars, and trade shows. He presented on biocompatibility at the American College of Toxicology and annual meeting in 2013, and has many published articles on biocompatibility topics. He is a participating member on all AAMI, TC 194, and ISO 10993 committees, and plays an active role along with the FDA and regulatory committees developing standards, discussing biocompatibility methods, and voting on changes to those standards. As one of a select group of experts in the industry, Thor's participation on the committee offers him insight into industry changes and helps prepare clients for changes in testing. We can definitely stand to learn a lot from him and his expertise. So with that, I'll hand the presentation over to Thor. Go ahead, Thor.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining me. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be around the world. I'm always excited to be talking about medical device regulations, but how they impacted biocompatibility. Biocompatibility is my passion, my love. I've been doing it for 20 years. It's something that I really have found fulfilling in a career. And so I try to absorb everything I can as far as regulations that impact biocompatibility, and have some good relationships with different regulatory bodies that help understand where impact may come. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about how the MDR is shaping up and how it impacts biocompatibility. This is going to be more of a review, since I think by now most people kind of understand where the MDR is. I hope so. It's coming up in May, right? And we'll just kind of walk through and kind of talk about what people are doing right now to get ready for when their device's CE mark becomes up for renewal, and kind of the gap analysis that people are doing to make sure that they're ready for the MDR. But another thing that's hit recently that's really kind of changed a little bit on the European submission process or regulatory process for medical devices is with Brexit, and how the Brexit has impacted now another regulatory arena. It's basically made another arena to think about when you're looking at where to go with your medical device as far as sales go. So we're talking about all those today. So where are we today with MDR? So when you start looking at MDR, you know that it was supposed to be 2020. COVID kind of, like everything, kind of messed that up. And so they extended it to this year, May of 2021. So that's coming around the corner. The interesting part about the timing, though, is it impacted at the same time as a lot of standards were updated, and not just updated, like substantially changed. And the most impactful of these changes came from recently. We updated in 2018 the 10993-1, and that was a significant. In fact, it was probably the most significant change in that standard since that standard was originally written. We made significant changes on how to approach biocompatibility from a risk-based approach, away from a checkbox mentality, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But also, in 2020, we came out with the new 1093-18, which is chemical characterization. And this is really developing in the way we evaluate systemic toxicity issues from medical devices, getting away from some of the more traditional ways we evaluated these endpoints. So with this risk-based approach and with the new chemistry, this is impacting the same time as this new MDR. And it's kind of like a perfect storm. MDR would have been a lot more easy to deal with if we just had the same standards we've always used, just now the new MDR came out. But because the MDR kind of hit at the same time as these updated standards, it's causing a little bit of a pain as far as devices that are currently on the market and have been on the market for a long time. Also, for those devices that are gas pack devices that have their CE mark before 2017 or just recently, the new ISO 18562, which is the biocompatibility of gas pack devices, has been released. And so if these devices have not been tested to this standard, now there's a gap there that has to be filled. Okay, so a little bit of timeline and the impact from the MDR. So obviously in 2017, the MDRs were ratified. Like I mentioned before, it was going to be impacted on the 2020 in May, but because of COVID, it was extended to May 2021. And that goes out to May 2025, where all devices on the market must be MDR compliant. The impacts from the MDR, though, the things that really make a difference from a biocompatibility standpoint is this first point, which is there's no grandfathering. And this is like a pretty impactful thing for biocompatibility because of the standards I mentioned before. So all of the devices that are currently under the MDD regulations, when they go to be submitted under MDR, the company just can't say, well, these devices have been on the market for 20 years, 30 years, whatever it may be. We have no clinical data to show any sensitization or any toxicity. So there's no biocompatibility risks. I'm not saying that you can't use some data to help try to evaluate the risk of your medical device, but you just can't say we're grandfathered because we're safe. We've been on the market. So the current standards don't apply to us. You're basically treating these devices as brand new devices that are first to the market again. And so they have to go under these new ISO standards, which I just mentioned, and the others. So really, we're finding these huge gaps in evaluations for devices that have been on the market for a long time. So a lot of our companies are actually deciding if and which devices make sense to keep on the European market. They'll look at sales of those devices. Maybe some of our companies have tons of catalog, a huge catalog of devices that are on the European market. Some of them just different variants of the same device. So they're really consolidating the devices they're going to be putting back out under MDR. And sometimes they're taking it off the European market altogether based on the kind of work that's going to be required to have them under MDR. And so there's also an expanded definition of what's considered a medical device. There's also changes in classes of medical devices. So there are devices that were class 1 before. They're now class 3. Defibrillators is a good example of this. So these devices obviously have much higher scrutiny now with the notified bodies. So there's a lot of changes that happen. There's also some requirements of a qualified person who's responsible for the compliance legally for these devices. So these are some of these devices that are kind of hitting a little bit with medical or biocompatibility. But just recently, we also had Brexit. Like I said, it's kind of a perfect storm. And Brexit, basically what they did is made the UK its own regulatory arena. You know, in the past, we used to ask our companies when we first started assessing Biocomp, where are you going? Like, where are your markets that you're looking to get this device into? North America, Asia, like China, Japan, Korea, Europe, because they would all have their unique biocompatibility kind of requirements, and we would want to develop a plan that kind of made sure we hit every single one of those. Well, now with Brexit, we have the UK, which has its own unique type of requirements. And so we pretty much made an additional market that we have to think about, and we'll kind of talk about that here in a minute. Okay, So when we talk about MDR remediation, there's a lot that goes into that outside of Biocomp, obviously. But when we start looking at the actual testing goes, sterilization validations haven't changed much in the last couple decades. Packaging validations changed a little bit, but for the most part, you're pretty good. Cleaning validations have changed more recently, but like reusable devices, reprocessing, if they're reprocessed, that's something that has to be evaluated. But by and large, the biggest impact as far as testing goes for MDR has been biocompatibility. And one is because it affects almost all medical devices that aren't necessarily class ones. And then two, because we've seen these new standards, that the process, the assessments are totally different. So many of the devices that were currently on the market in Europe were based off of safe off the clinical use. I've been doing this, like I said, for 2 decades. And when I first started, it was not uncommon to look at a piece of a stainless steel medical device or a cobalt chrome medical device, or even a silicone or polypropylene medical device, and just make a justification about safety, maybe doing a cytotoxicity test based off the materials. And not doing anything else for the European market. A lot of our companies previously, historically, would actually go to Europe first to get their CE mark, and then once they got revenue from the European market, they would then go here to North America. We're actually seeing that switch now, which is interesting. But and so outdated, limited testing methods were used. Very old tests sometimes were used, or very non-traditional tests were used to justify safety. It was a lot more open, 10 years ago for a CE mark. But because there were some issues in the patient population, the ones that people point out most routinely are the breast plant issues that happened in Europe, and also the metal hip implants that happen everywhere. There's also oil residuals that happen on some hip implants, or knee implants, excuse me, that caused issues. But there were also other ones that, that both the FDA and the notified bodies and the European Commission kind of kept track of, and saw that they were having some lack of control. And so because of this, they implemented the new MDR, and they implemented the non-grandfathering clause, which means that now you can't say that this device is safe because it's made out of the same material that you've been using in the market forever. You can't say that anymore. So now we have to evaluate it based on a new device. And this is the chart out of the new ISO 1093-1 2018. And this chart, like I said, is the biggest change in this chart since we first started the chart. Well, I should say I was not even in the industry when we first came out with this chart, but it's the biggest change. And the biggest change, the two biggest change, are the things that are impacting our customers right now, which is that first column we added, and it says physical and or chemical information. And as you can see, it has an X. Okay, so that means that every device that goes to notified body for MDR, or goes to MHRA for EU or UK evaluation, has to have physical or chemical information done. The concept is that this physical and chemical information, once completed, will then drive the other endpoints. So based off of your physical and chemical information and the risk of your device, you evaluate the other biological endpoints in this chart, like cytotoxicity, sensitization, irritation, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a risk-based approach. You understand a lot about your materials and your processing of your medical device. You look at how it's used, and based off of those endpoints or inputs, you then determine what risks are still there and what you have to test to mitigate those risks. The issue we're seeing, though, is all medical devices, well, I shouldn't say all, but the vast majority of medical devices, when they went to market the first time under MDD, they did not perform any physical or chemical information on that material. So when they do their gap analysis, even if they've done all these other tests, even if they have checkboxed everything for their category, they still have not done the one thing that's required, which is gather physical or chemical information. And so this has been the gap. And because of this, chemistry labs right now that do extractable leachables and material evaluations for medical devices are just overburdened. I mean, the demand is way outpaced the supply when it comes to these types of chemistry tests. And so there are some extreme backlogs right now within the industry. They're getting better. Resources are being brought in, and more and more devices are going through this MDR, so they're getting less and less required. But it's still right now a big backlog in the industry when it comes to dealing with physical and chemical information. Now, I do want to point out, it does say physical and/or chemical information. It does not require chemistry. And the reason behind that is it's based on the risk of the device. The more risky the device is, the more weight you're probably going to have to put on the chemistry part of it. So if you have a vascular implant like a stent, you're going to need a very good material information to not have to do chemistry. Most of the time, you're probably going to be stuck doing chemistry because you're not going to gather that sufficient of information. But if you're looking like a sling or even a Band-Aid or something like that, we could get by with doing physical information only, depending on the risk of the device and the type of information we get. So there's a balance there. The more risky the device is, the more information you need to evaluate that risk, to mitigate it, and vice versa. So this X, though, really is the crux of the problems right now with MDR, which is the requirement to have this information and the lack of devices on the market that already have it. So with that, though, that's only the first step. You do also need to have a risk assessment done. So based off that chemical and physical information, the next step is to actually perform a risk assessment. And a lot of companies are performing this risk assessment. This also, remember this part, because when we get to the Brexit part of the discussion, this comes much more important, and we'll talk about that. But this risk assessment is gathering that information from your physical and chemical journey, your efforts, and then evaluating the risks, and then mitigating those risks through whatever testing you think may be necessary. This is an example of a biological evaluation plan and a gap analysis that Nelson puts together. So as you can see, these are the things that we put in our BEPs. Obviously, we're going to be happy to help you with the BEP if you need it, but the qualified person can write a BEP themselves. It doesn't have to be a lab to write it. But these are just some good information that we put in our BEPs that you guys can look and see if you want to have it in yours. Before we change, I just want to, once again, this is a risk assessment in heart. And I know I always joke, I say, if you want to have a good drinking game during my presentation, if everybody wants to take a shot when I say risk, we'd end up having a great time. And that's because it is about risk. And so this plan, too many people get caught up in the plan part of it, where they just want to list the testing they're going to do. The main part of this is a risk assessment. So make sure you look at the device and how it's used and the materials and really evaluate that risk before you just jump into saying, this is my plan to do the test. It feeds into one another. I see a lot of people mess that up by just doing a plan without doing a risk. And by the way, this also is, and I know we're talking about MDR and Brexit, but the FDA is really starting to put a lot of emphasis on BEPs too. So a well-written BEP and risk assessment with a plan will help you in almost every single market. So when you start looking at these BEPs, though, you want to kind of understand the options that you have in these BEPs, right? So what you want to do is, once you realize the material information you have and the required endpoints for your evaluation, you want to go through each one of those and make a decision. Your general options to address these different endpoints are either a written evaluation. This is a risk assessment or an evaluation written on that risk. So this would be like a sensitization evaluation. If, for example, you did sensitization before on a device, but maybe you've changed some materials or processing from the device you originally ran sensitization on to the device you're now looking to get MDR. What we could do is look at those change and evaluate it for sensitization. Is that material you added a sensitizer, or is that processing residual you potentially have on there a sensitizer? So we may be able to evaluate sensitization through a risk-based approach. You can always do the traditional biocompatibility tests, or in some cases, this chemistry we're talking about, followed by a toxicological risk assessment, can actually take the place of that traditional biocomp test. So here we have cytotoxicity. honestly, if you have to rerun cytotox, you're probably just going to run the traditional biocomp test. It's cheap, it's quick, it's the most sensitive test. So we don't really want or see the need or the reason why you would not just run this test. Unless you have something you know is going to be a cytotoxic failure, like silver or copper or zinc or something like that, then maybe we'd write an evaluation on it instead of testing it. But for the most part, you just run this test. But some other endpoints, like I mentioned before, sensitization or irritation, we may want to actually do a written evaluation for those risks instead of running the sensitization test. So the sensitization test, it takes about 8 to 9 weeks to run and costs anywhere between $12,000 to $13,000, somewhere in that ballpark. So that's a quite expensive and long test. If we can address that endpoint by a risk assessment, by evaluating it through the change, then that's going to save a lot of time and money. Same with irritation. You may also just want to rerun those tests if these are for devices that didn't traditionally run those tests to begin with. Then we have material-mediated pyrogenicity. This is one that we would either run the traditional biocomp test for, or we could do a written evaluation with. And then we have the systemic toxicity endpoints. And this includes acute, subacute, chronic, genotox, carcinogenicity. So these endpoints, we can either assess through a written addressing without doing any testing. More often, we do the chemistry to evaluate these endpoints. This is the biological endpoints per 10993-18 and 1 that we can assess through chemistry, okay? Implants, we cannot, because that's about surface characteristics, not leachables. And these other tests are not considered systemic, although there's some argument on a couple of them, like sensitization. But for the most part, what's been decided is these tests that are bracketed are the ones we can use chemistry for. So if you have to run chemistry for a gap anyway, we can evaluate these endpoints using those chemistry evaluations. And like I said, implant would have to either be done through written evaluation or biological tests. I want to also mention that don't think that you have to do these tests, automatically checkbox. We recently just did an MDR submission for a bare metal stent. Well, we didn't, our customer did. And they didn't want to do any animal tests. So we were able to do all the evaluation on that bare metal stent through the testing they already performed, through chemistry, and through SEM, a surface scanning electron microscopy on the surface of that stent to be able to evaluate the surface characteristics. So we were able to look at hemocompatibility, we were looking at implantation, and then these other endpoints using written and evaluations in chemistry. So that stent was able to go through without any animal tests. So consider it's not, we traditionally always think of biocompatibility as running animal tests. And remember, that's not the case. The new standards are risk-based approach. So you want to do your material and chemistry evaluation and then evaluate what other endpoints are needed. The other thing to think about when you start looking at your MDR gap analysis is even though you may have multiple devices on the market, we can do family groupings to do these types of risk assessments. What I do want you to remember when you look at family groupings, from a biocompatibility perspective, the things we concern ourselves with are material and processing. And so material has to do with patient contacting surface area. So sometimes what I'll see is someone saying, oh, I'll take this device because it has these materials, and then this device has similar materials, only a couple other. So I'll add those to the, the family grouping, and then I'll add this one because it only has one additional material. And that makes sense, but remember, it's about surface area to volume ratio. So once you start adding other surface area or other materials, you could be diluting out the one that doesn't have those materials in it. So you really want to think through these family groupings very carefully. And if you are adding materials that a device does not have, maybe you don't add that surface area to the test extraction volume. So you're still testing it, but you're just not adding it to the actual extraction volume calculation. So it's like a worst case. But what I would really recommend is if you're doing family groupings in your biological evaluation plan, make sure you go through and spell out your justification of why you added those different devices to that family grouping. Something like a plate that has different sizes, that's easy because it's the same material and processing, but you're just doing like bigger size or smaller size. So keep those in mind. But family groups are important. And I'm going to go really quickly over CMRs because we don't have a whole lot of time. But the other thing in the MDR is about carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxins. And this is a part of the CMRs that talk about it. Basically, these are the annexes that have the list of chemicals where you can find these CMRs. But you can't have more than 0.1% by weight of this on there. We did come up with a flow chart to try to help you go through a CMR evaluation. But let me just tell you, by far, the easiest thing you can do is get this information from your suppliers. We can go through this flow chart if you can't get that from your supplier, but it's so much easier to get a statement from your supplier that does not contain over 0.1% by weight of a CMR present in your materials. Because if not, we have to go through this, and there's still some questions about the validity of this flow chart. But we have done this flow chart. It has worked in MDR submissions, but it's easier if you don't have to do it. Okay, so in the next few minutes, let's just cover Brexit and how does Brexit kind of play into this. Brexit, I don't know if many people have thought about the impact that Brexit's going to have if you sell your device in the UK. But remember, MHRA is now going to be an independent market, right? It's going to be a standalone UK regulator, so it's not going to be the same as the EU. Now they will, and this comes from the most recent conversation I've had with them. They are planning to follow the EU systems, but they're going to have a little bit of changes. They want to be able to do this to their own whims. So the MDR is not going to apply to Britain. So they're developing their own domestic system. They've already met with us a couple of times, and I'm sure they've met with other stakeholders to talk through how we evaluate medical devices and kind of the things they're looking at doing themselves. They will, and I'll get to this next slide, for short term recognize CE marks. So there is a kind of a grace period where you can use your CE mark in Great Britain. But there is a route that's going to be put in place later down the road to get their own mark that you'll have to follow. So for the next 2.5 years, that's to the 30th of June 2023, they will continue to recognize the CE mark, not to cut off supplies of medical devices to Europe or to UK. And if you've done your CE mark with an existing UK notified body, then they will actually recognize that as a UK CA or a Great Britain mark device, and you can use that. But if you've done that, if that won't work in the EU, it would only work in Great Britain. And this is their new mark, the UK CA. It will be valid from basically this year, starting this year, and it'll be mandatory in July of 2023 to be selling devices in the UK. They are following the MDD and AIMDD and IVDD requirements, and a UK approval body must be used. These are some dates for registration based on the classes of your devices. This is more for, I think, just for your information, but you can see the registration dates are required based on the types of device you have. And the UK is requiring a responsible person for non-UK manufacturers that want to go into the British market. They can be an individual or company. They just need to be competent, which we'll get to in a minute. They must be established in the UK, and the responsible person must register on behalf of that non-UK manufacturer by those grace periods mentioned before. For us, though, the big impact of Brexit when it comes to dealing with this new UK mark is this sentence from the ISO 10993, which is appropriately qualified. This is people who do this initial risk assessments, appropriately qualified by training and experience, who are able to interpret its requirements and judge the outcome of the evaluation of each medical device. When talking with the MHRA, they specifically are pulling out this sentence in the ISO 10993, and they're establishing a high bar for this requirement. So basically, if you are an engineer, or if you don't have sufficient, what they judge to be sufficient experience and training to be able to evaluate biocompatibility of a medical device, then they may not accept your biological evaluation plan, even if it's well written and thought through. You know, they even talked about having toxicologists having to sign off on these BEPs. We push back on that a little bit because I have a lot of toxicologists that work for me. They're great at assessing the toxicity of chemicals, but they're not so great about understanding the material risk all the time. We have a couple of them that are, but understanding the material risk and the processing risks from like a surface characteristic perspective. And so we had a good discussion there, but they really are going to put some high bars on the people that they deem appropriately qualified by training and experience to do these assessments. So if you are looking to do UK as one of your areas, or you're submitting your medical device, keep that in mind, that your biological evaluation plan will probably be under a little bit more scrutiny as far as not the content, but at least the authorship of that assessment. So keep that in mind when you're writing your biological evaluation plans. Okay, I know that was pretty quick. We have a lot more educational resources through Nelson Labs and our sister company Sterigenics we have webinars and videos. You can go to our websites to find those. 30 minutes is tough to go through everything, but try to hit the hot spots. But I love answering questions. So like I mentioned before, please ask any questions you have. Here's my email address if you want to send me a question, but please reach out and at this time and ask any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Thor. That was great. I appreciate it. We did have several questions, so let me see if I can pick out some of the ones that might be a little more pertinent. One is, with the increased focus on the whole life cycle of the medical device in MDR, how much importance should we be putting into evaluating process like manufacturing residuals, additives, mold release agents, finishing agents, downstream processing? How much of this should be evaluated in the biological evaluation plan and report?
That's a great question. And honestly, we are developing some of our own guidance from Nelson on this particular issue. We're seeing in the new ISO, it talks about, and in the MDR, it talks about evaluating medical device safety through its life cycle, right? And so that does mean downstream processing. It also means shelf life. What can happen on the device, that plastic as it sits on a shelf for 4 or 5 years? Those things should be evaluated in the biological evaluation plan. You would need someone to be able to look at those materials and understand the risk of it sitting on a shelf. You know, you have cross-linking that could degrade, things like that within the polymer that could release additives that didn't release at the very beginning. But at the same time, you don't want to do your testing on a device that's aged, because all those other processes that residuals we're talking about, like mold releases and things like that, could be semi-volatile or volatile and could be evaporated off by the time the end of shelf life. So you really do have to evaluate the risk of your device from time 0 all the way till its end. And that includes if it is reprocessed, like cleaned and reused, what impact happens there. So like I said, this is much more meaty than it once was. And so that's why your biological evaluation plan should be really well thought through for this type of submission, because it isn't just, oh, I did these tests, check, check, check. I did the test on the chart, I'm good to go. You really have to think about the risk of this medical device, not just at time 0, but through its life cycles, and looking at the residuals from the processing. So very good point. I do want to say that there's not any standard guidance on exactly how to do that right now. There is some chemistry that can be done pre and post, like FTIR on the polymers. Some people run cytotoxicity on a device that's been aged to look at its shelf life impact. We are looking to provide guidance soon from a Nelson perspective. We're getting everybody on the same page within our scientific group. So hopefully we'll be able to send that out to everyone what our recommendation is. But right now it is a little bit blurry what you should do for those types of evaluations.
Okay, thank you. Another one is, let me see here. How does this affect contract manufacturers where the end product does not have our company's name, et cetera, listed?
Yeah, so there's a couple of those. When you think about biocompatibility, really the person who's responsible for the biocompatibility is the person who's selling that device. So there's a lot of people who will, for example, provide syringes or things like that to a kit, and then that's repackaged and sterilized and sold. That the biocompatibility risk perspective is done on the person who's actually marketing and selling that kit in the company. or in the country. But remember, still, the safety evaluation is still on your shoulders, right? So, like, if there is some safety issue, either if they catch it or not, ultimately it could be tracked back to your device. So, if I was providing something to a medical device, I would at least have some kind of evaluation done. It doesn't have to be testing, like I talked about. I don't want you to think testing, but I would have some kind of evaluation done on my materials and processes so that I feel comfortable having this being used as a medical device.
Okay. Another one is, as the UK will require compliance with the MDD for the UK CA mark and the new ISO 10993-1 is not harmonized to the MDD, would the MHRA require compliance to ISO 10993-1 or the 2009 harmonized version?
Yeah, this is also a question I get quite a bit. And we did have this discussion with the MHRA. We have had it with notified bodies. Now, granted, this is under MDR, they talk about state of the art, right? So a lot of notified bodies are saying, I know that -1 isn't, a standard for a European standard yet, but it's the state of the art when it comes to science. And so they're going to regulate that. Even though they're not following MDR for the UK, talking to MHRA, they are following. In fact, there are some of their people in the MHRA that we deal with on the ISO are some key contributors to the new 10993 2018. So they are going to enforce 2018, even though they're going MDD.
Okay. Now, there's several questions about the qualified person or responsible person. So one of them is, can company experts be external consultants, advisors, or contractors? And just maybe a little bit of expounding on the required person.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on the qualified person role. But what I've sitting through and talking to them and talking with and attending some of the presentations and webinars, I'll go back to that particular thing. It can be anybody who the MHRA deems competent. So they have to be competent enough to be able to understand the regulations and the needs and communicate with the MHRA. But it can be anybody. It could be a consultant. It could be a company. It could be an individual. As long as they are established within the UK and the MHRA deems them competent to do so. Now, that competent is the only gray area. I'm not quite sure exactly what they would consider a competent, responsible person, but that's what they put out as a requirement. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Another is how to resolve when UK and EU have different recognized lists of standards. For example, UK still uses 14971 2012, but EU may recognize 14971 2019. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so this is going to happen maybe even in the future more and more, but it will definitely happen right now because, like you said, there are examples of those different recognized standards in the UK versus EU. My recommendation would be actually to come up with the worst case scenario for the standards. If you look at those two standards and you compare them, you can see where you would consider it a worst case and justify why you think it's the worst case. You have two options. One, you could either do two types of submissions, right? You could follow two types of standards, which I think would be a pain. It would be horrible. Or you can look at the two, compare them, do a gap analysis between the two different types of standards that you're looking at, and determine which one you consider to be in worst case, or the one that you consider the top science approach, depending on the type of standard, and justify that you're following that. Talking with the UK, they don't want to make it difficult. They don't want to be totally opposite from the EU. They recognize, especially in Europe, there are a lot of companies that they're basically looking to submit to both the UK and the EU, and they don't want to make it so drastically different. So at least my feelings talking to them is that they're going to be very relaxed, I guess, or available to look at different options when you look at different recognized standards.
Okay. Another was about labeling. How to label investigational devices for UK after Brexit. Yeah,
so I'm not aware of that one. I can find out. I can ask the MHRA. I did not talk to them about that particular thing, but if you don't have a contact in the MHRA but want to know that, please reach out to me in an email, and I can either get in contact with someone there or I can find out the answer for you.
Okay, great. Okay. There are a couple more very specific questions, so I'll kind of dive into those a little bit. Maybe we have a few minutes. Which tests of the ISO 10993-1 do we have to apply to our product if it's not intended to be used in direct contact with the patient's skin? It's a class 2A active device, which is not in direct contact with patient's skin, as the patient should wear a t-shirt to use the device on its stomach.
Okay, so I'll go back to the chart real fast. So first off, when you look at biocompatibility, remember that biocompatibility, it only applies to either devices that have direct or indirect patient contacting, okay? So if it does not have direct or indirect patient contact, biocompatibility 10993-1 does not apply. So what is direct, right? So that means that a patient is directly contacting the skin of the patient or of the user. Or as the new standard says, even the practitioner, the person using the device, like a nurse or doctor, if they're not gloved, if they're touching it with their skin, then you have to evaluate that with a risk-based approach. Indirect contacting devices are devices that either have gas or fluid running through part of the device and then goes into the patient, like a gas breathing tube or an IV set, right? So the IV bag doesn't have direct patient contact, but the fluids will leach chemicals from the IV bag and deliver it to the patient. So those are the ones that are evaluated. Now, even if the user of this active device is touching it with their skin, maybe above their shirt, but maybe they're touching it with their hands, there's also a new thing in the standard called transient contact, which means you're just touching it just for seconds with your intact skin of your hand or something like that. That's considered very low risk, right? Because how many things every day do we touch with our hands? How many materials do we touch with our hands? So those, once again, it's a risk-based approach. So if you're having that type of contact, then we would want to have some kind of justification put in place, but testing probably wouldn't be needed. But if you're having prolonged contact with a part of the skin that's not necessarily the hands, but somewhere else, or long-term contact with the hands, then we would want to evaluate at least some kind of testing. Worst case, you'd look up here is intact skin, probably permanent. So you're looking at the big three, which we call, right, cytotoxin, cessation, and irritation. But that's if you're having like actual real long tongue contact with the intact skin. And just because you have those endpoints, you can still do a physical or chemical information gathering exercise to look to evaluate those endpoints. Remember, the new standard does not say test, it says evaluate. So we want to evaluate the risk and then determine if any testing is necessary.
Okay. I have one other question that I think we may have time for. Do you feel the ISO 15223-2020 will be harmonized in line with the MDR? Yeah, that's the question there.
Yeah, so the harmonization process is, and this is coming from a lot of my friends in the European Commission, the harmonization process is kind of broken right now. And that's why notified bodies have they're not waiting for standards to be harmonized to put them in place. They're calling state of the art, or they're just using what they feel like is the most state of the art, the best science. So at this time, I actually can't predict when any of the standards will be harmonized. It's not the smoothest and easiest process right now to get a harmonized standard through Europe. So that's why, like I said, a lot of these are just going through unharmonized, but still being enforced based on that statement in the MDR. So that's a long answer to your question. I'm not sure if it's going to be harmonized in 2021. I'm not even sure if this ISO 10993-1 will be harmonized in 2021. But there's hopes that they will be, but that process is pretty laborious right now.
Okay. One other kind of related, I'll go ahead and add this question because it is sort of related to what you were just talking about. When does transient body contact on repeated accumulated use become something more than transient?
Yeah, this is a gray area, and a lot of people have this discussion. When we were at BEPs, we'll obviously look at transient contact, and we'll try to, if it's transient, then we don't perform the test usually. There is a time where that transient becomes non-transient when you have repeated use. Now, the way we write it is if it's still not intended to have repeated use, but you could touch it just daily repeat times, we still call that transient. But if you know that someone is putting their hands on it over and over and over again every day, interacting with it a lot, we would then not call it transient anymore, and we'd actually evaluate it on skin contact. But remember, like I said before, just because you're evaluating it doesn't mean I'm testing that, right? So even if I'm touching with my hand every day for the rest of my life, I'm not necessarily doing testing. I want to look at the materials. I want to look at the history of those materials with that type of contact. I'm going to look at the processing. A good example to this is one of our favorite active watches. I got to make sure I don't want to say their name. That the watch band had some irritation problems, right? It was in the news, and so that type of contact was just on the skin, but it caused irritation. So we still have those concerns. So we want to evaluate it if you're routinely touching the skin, but it doesn't mean we're testing. We want to look at the materials and understand the risks.
Okay. All right, that's all that we have time for today. So thank you so much for all the questions, and thank you so much, Thor, for your presentation. And we hope that you all are enjoying so far the True Quality Summit. Thank you so much. All right, talk to everybody later.